She's too trusting to notice. I'll paint her as unstable and get full custody." My husband Stephen's voice drifted from his office down the hall, casual and confident as he spoke to his brother on speakerphone. I froze in the kitchen doorway, my coffee mug halfway to my lips. The plan is already in motion. By Christmas, this will all be over. My name is Eleanor Conway. I'm 39 years old, and for 12 years, I believed I was living in a solid marriage with my husband, Stephen, a corporate attorney here in Sacramento, California. We have 2 children, Maya, who's 10, and Connor, who's 8. To anyone looking from the outside, we probably seemed like the perfect family. Stephen worked at Crimson Harbor Group, one of the most prestigious law firms in the city, and I managed our home while freelancing as a marketing consultant. But standing there in my own kitchen, listening to my husband discuss my destruction like a legal strategy, I realized how wrong I'd been about everything. The late nights at the office, the weekend conferences that seemed to multiply recently, the way he'd started looking at me like I was a stranger. It all suddenly made horrifying sense. What Stephen didn't know was that I was never as naive as he thought. In fact, I'd been watching him more carefully than he realized. For months, I'd noticed the small changes. Stephen used to text me when he'd be late, but lately, he just assumed I'd wait. He used to ask about my day, but now he barely looked up from his phone during dinner. Most telling of all, he'd started talking about Maya and Connor's future in ways that didn't include me. "When the kids are older, they'll understand why Daddy had to make difficult choices," he'd said just last week, and something about that phrasing had sent ice through my veins. Now I understood what those difficult choices meant. He was planning to divorce me and claim I was an unfit mother. The casual cruelty in his voice as he discussed stealing my children made my hands shake with fury. But even as rage flooded through me, a cold, calculating part of my mind was already working. Stephen thought he was the only strategic thinker in this marriage, but he was about to learn otherwise. I set down my coffee mug with deliberate care and walked quietly back to my office. Opening my laptop, I created a new folder on my desktop and labeled it simply, Evidence. Then I picked up my phone and started researching private investigators in Sacramento. Stephen wanted to play games with our family's future. He had no idea what he'd just started. The next morning, I sat across from Detective James Morrison in a small cafe downtown, choosing a location far from Stephen's usual haunts. Detective Morrison was in his 50s, with graying hair and sharp eyes that seemed to catch every detail. He'd come highly recommended by a colleague whose own divorce had revealed her husband's affair. "Tell me what's happening," Detective Morrison said, pulling out a small notepad. I explained the conversation I'd overheard, the changes in Stephen's behavior, and my growing suspicions about his secretary, Vanessa Torres. She was 26, fresh out of paralegal school, and had started working at Crimson Harbor Group about 8 months ago, right around the time Stephen's behavior began shifting. "Do you have any concrete evidence of an affair?" Detective Morrison asked. "Not yet," I admitted. "But I have a feeling there's more going on than just infidelity. Stephen mentioned moving money and painting me as unstable. He's been working on this plan for over a year, according to what I heard." Detective Morrison nodded grimly. "Financial manipulation in divorce cases is more common than people think. If your husband is planning to claim you're unfit, he's probably building a paper trail to support that narrative. We need to document everything before he can execute his plan." We discussed logistics, Stephen's schedule, his known associates, and the kind of evidence that would hold up in court. Detective Morrison explained that we'd need to be careful and thorough. "Your husband is a lawyer," he reminded me. "He'll know how to cover his tracks and challenge evidence. We need to be bulletproof." I returned home that afternoon feeling both terrified and oddly relieved. For months, I'd felt like I was going crazy, questioning my own perceptions and wondering if I was imagining problems in our marriage. Now I knew I wasn't paranoid. I was right. Stephen was planning to destroy me. but at least now I could fight back. That evening, Stephen came home late again, claiming he'd been working on a complex murder case. He kissed my cheek perfunctorily and asked about the kids' day, but I could see his mind was elsewhere. As we sat at dinner, Maya chatted about her school project while Connor described his soccer practice, and Stephen nodded along while checking his phone. "Everything okay at work?" I asked casually. "You seem stressed lately." Stephen looked up sharply, and for a moment, I saw something flicker in his eyes. Guilt, maybe, or calculation. "Just busy," he said. "This merger is taking everything out of me. I might need to work this weekend, too." "Of course," I said, smiling. "Whatever you need to do." But inside, I was already planning. Detective Morrison had given me a small recording device and taught me how to use it discreetly. If Stephen wanted to continue his phone conversations about destroying my life, I'd make sure every word was documented. He thought I was too trusting to notice his plans, but he was about to discover that the wife he'd underestimated was his greatest threat. 3 weeks into my secret investigation, Detective Morrison called with the first major breakthrough. "We've got hotel receipts," he said, his voice tight with professional excitement. "Your husband has been staying at the Fairmont Hotel downtown every Tuesday and Thursday for the past 2 months. The reservations are in his name, but there's a pattern of room service for 2. I sat in my car outside Maya's school, waiting for pickup time, and felt my world tilt. Hearing about Stephen's affair was different from having proof. "Are you certain?" I asked. "The hotel security cameras show him arriving with a young woman matching Vanessa Torres's description," Detective Morrison continued. "We have timestamps, receipts, and photographic evidence. But that's not all. I've been tracking the financial activity you mentioned, and Stephen has been very busy." He explained that Stephen had opened 3 separate accounts over the past 14 months, systematically transferring money from our joint savings and his business account. "He's moved almost $200,000, Detective Morrison said. "The transfers are small enough to avoid triggering automatic alerts, but consistent enough to suggest a long-term plan." My hands gripped the steering wheel until my knuckles went white. $200,000. Money we'd saved for the children's college funds, for our retirement, for family vacations we'd never take. Stephen had been stealing from his own family while planning to take my children away from me. "There's more," Detective Morrison said. "I've been monitoring his communications, and he's been in contact with a private investigator of his own. They've been discussing ways to document what they call your erratic behavior and financial irresponsibility." A bitter laugh escaped me. Financial irresponsibility? He's the one who moved $200,000 without telling me. Exactly, and that's going to be his downfall. I've also discovered that he's been meeting with Dr. Patricia Webb, a psychiatrist who specializes in custody evaluations. The meetings aren't documented as official consultations, which suggests he's been coaching her on what to look for when she eventually evaluates you. I closed my eyes, overwhelmed by the scope of Stephen's deception. This wasn't just an affair or even a simple divorce. This was a calculated campaign to destroy my credibility as a mother and steal my children. He'd been planning this for over a year, methodically building a case against me while I'd been living my life completely unaware. But Detective Morrison wasn't finished. "Eleanor, I need you to stay calm and keep acting normal. We're building an ironclad case, but we need a few more weeks. Can you do that?" I thought about Maya's upcoming school play and Connor's soccer tournament, about bedtime stories and family dinners where Stephen sat plotting my destruction. "Yes," I said finally, "I can do that." As I hung up and walked into the school to collect Maya, I practiced my smile. Stephen thought he was so clever, so strategic. He had no idea that every move he made was being documented, every secret meeting recorded, every stolen dollar tracked. The lawyer in him would appreciate the thoroughness of the case being built against him, if only he knew it existed. By December, I had enough evidence to destroy Stephen's life 10 times over, but Detective Morrison insisted we wait until after the holidays. "Let him think he's winning," the detective advised. The more confident he gets, the more mistakes he'll make. Stephen's confidence was indeed growing. He'd started leaving his phone unlocked around the house, apparently secure in the belief that I was too naive to check it. During one of his weekend conferences, I photographed dozens of text messages between him and Vanessa. The conversations ranged from sickeningly romantic to coldly strategic discussions about our divorce timeline. By February, Eleanor will be out of the picture, Stephen had texted Vanessa just 3 days ago. The kids will adjust quickly, and we can start fresh. Vanessa had responded with heart emojis and a message that made my stomach turn. I can't wait to be their new mom. I'll be so much better for them than she ever was. The audacity was breathtaking. This woman, who'd never changed a diaper or sat through a school conference or held a sick child through the night, thought she could simply replace me in my children's lives. But her arrogance was also useful. Detective Morrison explained that family courts looked very unfavorably on parents who brought their affair partners into custody discussions before the divorce was even filed. Meanwhile, Stephen's behavior at home became increasingly strange. He'd started taking phone calls from his office at odd hours, often stepping outside or into the garage. He'd also begun asking leading questions about my daily routine, my stress levels, and my relationships with other parents at the kids' school. Eleanor seems pretty overwhelmed lately. I overheard him telling his brother during one of their weekly calls. She snapped at Maya yesterday over homework, and Connor mentioned she forgot to pack his lunch twice this week. Both statements were complete lies, but I realized Stephen was manufacturing incidents to support his future claims about my fitness as a mother. Detective Morrison had warned me this would happen, so I'd started keeping detailed notes about my interactions with the children, complete with photos and timestamps. When Stephen eventually tried to paint me as neglectful, I'd have proof of every school pickup, every homework session, every bedtime story. The most disturbing discovery came right before Christmas. Detective Morrison called me while I was wrapping presents in the basement, and his voice was unusually grim. Eleanor, we've uncovered something that changes everything. Stephen hasn't just been moving money. He's been working with someone at his firm to manipulate his income reporting. My blood ran cold. What do you mean? He's been artificially reducing his documented salary and bonuses to minimize potential alimony payments. But here's the interesting part. The money he's been hiding isn't going into personal accounts. It's being funneled through a complex series of transfers that suggest money laundering. I sat down hard on the basement steps, surrounded by Christmas wrapping paper and ribbon. Money laundering? Stephen? It gets worse. Some of the client accounts he's been managing show irregularities that suggest he's been skimming funds. We're talking about serious criminal activity, Eleanor. This isn't just about your divorce anymore. The implications hit me like a physical blow. If Stephen was embezzling client funds, his career wasn't just at risk, his freedom was. And if he was caught, Maya and Connor would have to live with the shame of having a father in prison. Part of me felt sick at the thought of what this would do to them. But another part felt a cold satisfaction. Stephen had been planning to destroy my reputation and steal my children, but his own greed and arrogance had led him into criminal territory. What do we do now? I asked. We document everything and prepare for the possibility that this becomes a criminal matter, Detective Morrison said. But first, we need to protect you and the children. If Stephen realizes we're onto him, he might do something desperate. The revelation about Stephen's criminal activity changed everything about my strategy. Detective Morrison introduced me to Catherine Walsh, a criminal defense attorney who specialized in white-collar crime. Catherine was in her 40s, with steel gray hair, and an intensity that made me feel safer just being in her presence. Your husband has been incredibly sloppy, Catherine said, reviewing the financial documents Detective Morrison had gathered. He's left a paper trail that any forensic accountant could follow. The question is whether he's acting alone or if others at his firm are involved. We were meeting in Catherine's office on a Saturday morning while Stephen was supposedly at another conference. The irony wasn't lost on me. While he was planning my destruction, I was building a case that would end his career and possibly send him to prison. The client fund skimming is the most serious charge, Catherine continued. We're looking at embezzlement, breach of fiduciary duty, and potentially fraud. If convicted, he could face 10 to 15 years in prison. My hands trembled as I absorbed this information. 10 to 15 years. Maya would be in her 20s when Stephen got out. Connor would be finished with college. Their father would miss their entire childhood because of his own greed and betrayal. What about the divorce proceedings? I asked. Can we still protect the children's interests? Catherine smiled grimly. Oh, the divorce is going to be the least of Stephen's problems. When this criminal case breaks, his ability to fight for custody will be non-existent. No family court judge is going to award children to a parent facing federal charges. Detective Morrison leaned forward in his chair. We've also been investigating Vanessa Torres. She's not as innocent as she appears. Some of the financial transfers went through accounts in her name, which suggests she's been actively participating in the scheme. This news should have shocked me, but somehow it didn't. The woman who thought she could replace me as Maya and Connor's mother was also complicit in stealing from Stephen's clients. The poetic justice was almost too perfect. How long before you have enough to press charges? I asked. We're coordinating with the FBI's white-collar crime unit, Catherine said. They want to make sure we catch everyone involved before anyone has a chance to destroy evidence or flee. We're looking at moving sometime in late January or early February. The timeline made me laugh bitterly. Stephen had told Vanessa that I'd be out of the picture by February. Instead, he'd be the one facing complete destruction of his life and freedom. Over the next few weeks, I watched Stephen with new eyes. Every late night at the office, every secretive phone call, every lie about weekend conferences, all of it was building toward his eventual downfall. He'd grown so confident in his deception that he'd stopped being careful, and that carelessness was going to cost him everything. On New Year's Eve, as we sat with Maya and Connor watching fireworks on television, Stephen put his arm around me and said, "This is going to be a big year for our family, Eleanor. I have a feeling everything is going to change." I smiled and leaned into him, playing the role of the unsuspecting wife one last time. "I think you're right," I said. "I think this year is going to bring exactly what we all deserve." He squeezed my shoulder, completely missing the double meaning in my words. In just a few weeks, Stephen would discover that sometimes getting what you deserve isn't the same as getting what you want. On January 15th, exactly 3 months after I'd first contacted Detective Morrison, everything came to a head in a way that even my darkest fantasies couldn't have imagined. I was at home with the children when my phone rang. Catherine Walsh's name appeared on the screen, and my heart immediately began racing. "Eleanor, it's happening today," Catherine said without preamble. "The FBI is moving on Stephen and several others at his firm within the hour. Are you somewhere safe with the children?" I looked around our living room, where Maya was working on a puzzle, and Connor was reading a book about dinosaurs. Safe seemed like a relative term when your husband was about to be arrested for federal crimes. "We're at home," I said. "Should we leave?" "No, stay put. The agents will likely come to the house to search for evidence, but you and the children aren't in any danger. This is actually the best-case scenario for you. Stephen will be processed and arraigned, which means he won't be able to come home and potentially destroy evidence or intimidate you." As if on cue, I heard the sound of multiple cars pulling into our driveway. Through the front window, I could see black SUVs and unmarked sedans filling our normally quiet street. Maya looked up from her puzzle with curiosity. "Mommy, why are there so many cars outside?" she asked. I took a deep breath, knowing that this moment would change my children's lives forever. "There are some police officers who need to ask Daddy some questions about his work," I said carefully. "It's going to be okay, but things might be a little confusing for a while." The doorbell rang, and I opened it to find 2 FBI agents with a search warrant. They were professional and courteous, explaining that they needed to examine Stephen's home office and any financial documents. As they worked, I called my mother and asked her to come pick up Maya and Connor. There was no point in having them witness their home being searched by federal agents. Within an hour, the agents had filled several boxes with documents from Stephen's office. They also seized his laptop and a filing cabinet full of what they called relevant materials. As they prepared to leave, one of the agents handed me a business card. "Mrs. Conway, your husband has been arrested on charges of embezzlement, wire fraud, and money laundering," she said. "He's being held pending arraignment, which will likely happen on Monday. You'll want to contact an attorney if you haven't already." I held the card with steady hands, though inside I felt like I was floating outside my own body. "What about his girlfriend, Vanessa Torres?" "Miss Torres was arrested at the law firm this morning," the agent said. "She's facing similar charges related to her participation in the financial scheme." After the agents left, I sat alone in my eerily quiet house and called Detective Morrison. "It's over," I said when he answered. "The criminal case is just beginning," he corrected. "But yes, Stephen's plan to destroy you is definitely over. How are you holding up?" I looked around at the home Stephen had planned to take from me, thought about the children he'd tried to steal, and considered the life he'd intended to ruin. "I'm better than okay," I said. "I'm free." That evening, local news outlets began reporting on the arrests at Crimson Harbor Group. Stephen's mugshot appeared on television, looking nothing like the confident, calculating man who'd planned my destruction. Instead, he looked exactly like what he was, a criminal who'd been caught red-handed. My phone buzzed with a text from a number I didn't recognize. It was brief, but satisfying. "This is Stephen's brother. We need to talk." Even his family was already distancing themselves from him. The man who'd thought he was too clever to be caught had instead proven that pride truly does come before a fall. The arraignment hearing was scheduled for Monday morning, and Catherine Walsh had arranged for me to attend as an observer. I wanted to see Stephen's face when he realized how completely his world had collapsed. Maya and Connor were staying with my mother for the week, sparing them from seeing their father in an orange jumpsuit. The courthouse was buzzing with reporters and curious onlookers. Stephen's arrest had become a major story in Sacramento. A prominent attorney brought down by his own greed made for compelling headlines. As I sat in the gallery with Catherine, I spotted several of Stephen's colleagues from Crimson Harbor Group, looking shell-shocked and worried about their own potential involvement. When Stephen was led in wearing handcuffs and jail-issued clothing, he looked like a completely different person from the confident man who'd planned to paint me as unstable. His hair was disheveled, his face pale, and his eyes darted nervously around the courtroom. When his gaze found mine, I saw something I'd never seen before: genuine fear. The charges were read aloud: embezzlement of client funds totaling $450,000, wire fraud, money laundering, and conspiracy. Each count carried potential prison sentences that added up to decades behind bars. Vanessa Torres stood at a separate podium facing identical charges, her designer suit a stark contrast to the gravity of her situation. When the judge asked about bail, the prosecutor argued that both defendants were flight risks, given the evidence of offshore accounts and hidden assets. Stephen's expensive defense attorney tried to argue for his client's ties to the community, but the judge was unimpressed. Bail was set at $2 million each, an amount that Stephen's frozen assets couldn't cover. As Stephen was led away, he turned back one more time to look at me. This time, I met his gaze directly and smiled. For 12 years, I'd been the trusting wife who believed in our marriage. Now I was the woman who'd brought down his entire criminal enterprise with patience, intelligence, and the help of professionals who knew how to build an airtight case. Within a week of Stephen's arrest, my divorce attorney filed papers that made his custody dreams impossible. With Stephen facing federal charges and potentially decades in prison, the family court proceedings became a formality. I was awarded temporary full custody of Maya and Connor, along with control of all marital assets that weren't frozen as evidence in the criminal case. The irony was perfect. Stephen had spent over a year moving money and building a case to prove I was an unfit mother, but his own criminal behavior had given me everything he'd tried to take away. The house he'd planned to claim was now mine. The children he'd wanted to steal from me would grow up knowing their father chose greed over family. Detective Morrison's final report detailed the full scope of Stephen's deception. The affair with Vanessa had been just the tip of the iceberg. Together, they'd been skimming money from client accounts for over 18 months, using sophisticated financial instruments to hide their theft. The money had been funding not just their relationship, but also Vanessa's expensive lifestyle and Stephen's secret gambling addiction. A detail that explained why he'd needed so much cash so quickly. "Your husband got greedy," Detective Morrison explained during our final meeting. "If he'd stopped at the affair and a simple divorce, he might have gotten away with it. But the money laundering and embezzlement created a paper trail that was impossible to hide once we started looking." I thought about Stephen sitting in his jail cell, probably still believing he was the smartest person in the room. He'd underestimated me so completely that he'd never considered I might fight back. His assumption that I was too trusting to notice had been his fatal flaw. I'd noticed everything. I'd simply been smart enough to document it all before making my move. Maya and Connor were adjusting better than I'd expected. They knew their father had made serious mistakes at work and would be away for a long time. But they didn't need to understand the full details yet. What mattered was that they felt safe and loved, something I could provide now that Stephen's destructive plans had been permanently derailed. Looking back at the woman I'd been 3 months ago, worried about my marriage but too afraid to confront the truth, I barely recognized her. Stephen had tried to destroy that woman, but instead, he'd created someone far more dangerous, a mother with nothing left to lose and everything to protect. As I tucked Maya and Connor into bed that night, listening to their laughter and knowing they were safe from Stephen's manipulations, I realized that sometimes the best revenge is simply letting someone's own choices destroy them. Stephen had planned my downfall with meticulous care, but his arrogance and greed had ultimately written his own ending. In trying to prove I was too trusting to notice his deception, he'd created the very woman who would bring about his complete destruction.